Welcome to another edition of The Other Perspective with me, Abel Eseru. Today we are going to be discussing about political transitions in Africa. Our guest today will be Mr. Henry Muguzi, who is an expert in the field of electoral democracy. Shall also have Mr. Felix Kafuma, who is an expert in the area of political finance. Mr. Eddie Kainda, who is an economist, and Mr. Gerald Koraneza, who is the youth in political activists. We do know that Africa has witnessed a trajectory of political transitions, but the manner in which some of these transitions have been achieved has not been welcomed by some people. Of recent, we have seen peaceful transitions that have occurred in countries like DRC Congo. We have seen transitions in Burundi, in Zambia, and all this were achieved through elections. But we have also been able to see 10 coups occurring in 10 countries from 2010 up to date. Some of these countries include Niger, Mali, Central African Republic, Egypt, Sudan, Zimbabwe, Guinea, Tunisia. And from 2012 to date, Mali is the one that has experienced about 3 coups. So today we want to interrogate the key issues that need to be addressed so that we have meaningful political transitions in Africa. Kindly, before we proceed with the show, kindly subscribe to all our social media platforms. On YouTube, it's ACFIM Uganda. On Facebook, it's ACFIM. On Twitter, it's ACFIM UG. Kindly subscribe and keep following our discussions. So I want to start with Mr. Henry Muguzi. We have seen how Africa has been experiencing political transitions. They have been coming in form of elections, they have been coming in form of coups, military coups, and the rest. So from your own perspective as an expert in the field of electoral democracy, how do you think Africa has fared in a manner of having meaningful political transitions in the continent?
Thank you very much, Abel, and of course, thank you, Abel, and of course to our viewers. It's always a pleasure to share our insights with you, and we respect and love the time you give us to listen to whatever we have to share as Pan-Africanists. Now, we shall recall that from history, there was a time when military coups were in vogue. In vogue meaning they were in fashion. In fact, some of the sarcastic scholars from the West at one time knew that military coups had become more common than breakfast in Africa. That is, I think, in the late 60s and the early 1970s. But of course, from the 1990s, you get to see that many African countries started embracing the principles of democracy as a better way to transit, because the military coups, as much as they were as common as breakfast, did not yield a lot. In fact, many countries were left to rue the chances that were lost. So from the late 1990s to as we enter the 2000s, we get to have a feel that Africa finally has embraced democracy as a better system of transiting from one regime to the next. But of course, there are countries such as Uganda, which have never tested a peaceful transition. Those countries are there, but there are also countries that have tested it and have gone it. But unfortunately, we have now seen kind of a reversal of what we thought were gains in the area of managing political transitions, because the military coups, as you have rightly quoted, the attempted one in Sudan, the Mali junta, the junta taking over an elected government in Mali, the coup of Guinea. Of course, before then, the coup in Zimbabwe, which they kept denying it wasn't, but which was a coup in everything but name. So you get to see that there is a sense in which coups are beginning to come back. Now, the worry for Africa is that we have a history of regimes that have leaders that have served for decades. And when you look around, if you look at countries like Somalia, where the autocratic Siad Barre ruled until he got tired, immediately he left the stage, the country descended into chaos, and they have never recovered from that, even to this present day. Libya, after the strong ruler left, the country still struggles up to today. If you look at other countries such as Sudan, with the going of al-Bashir, peace has never returned to that country. In fact, they attempted a coup. They've tried everything, including democracy, and nothing seems to be working. If you look at countries such as Zimbabwe, yes, you have a semblance of democracy, but there are lots of questions that linger on whether what we are seeing is democracy. And the list can go on and on and on in Africa. The question we can pose as Africans, are we really incapable of handling transitions? I don't think we can. I don't think we are. I think we should. But I think we normally get to be a lot of us, including those in political leadership, tend to go to sleep and do little planning. As a matter of fact, I think most of the planning that goes on in these governments and within our citizens is a planning that is directed towards the self-enrichment. And therefore, until we have gone back to the drawing board, okay, to develop and to discuss and agree, to have what you can call a serious conversation on what kind of democracy we want to manage and roll out as Africans, but also how can we embed the cultures of Africans. You know, in history, Africans are monarchical. Many of if you look around, even to this present day, and speak to citizens in Tanzania, or speak to citizens in Nigeria, and or speak to citizens in South Africa, they will tell you one thing, that for us, we are more interested in a government that is accountable. We are interested in services. We want to make sure that we can bring food to the table. They're not so much interested in what takes place in state houses and white houses and the palaces of presidents. They just want good opportunities and the opportunities to make a living. And therefore, because many of the Africans are less concerned about what happens there, they have left the matters of politics in the hands of a few elites that are so greedy and are so unrelenting, and their appetites are quite insatiable, that none of them wants to leave the other. And many of them do not take politics as a service. I think they take politics as as a right, their own right, as their property, and I think the sweetness and the facilities and the power that goes with the presidency always deludes them to imagine that they can be in power forever. That's my initial take. Thank you. Abel, are you muted, or I don't hear a thing from your side?
Oh, sorry. I was saying, Felix, you've just had Henry referring us back to the 1960 history, where military coups used to be referred to as breakfast. And we are seeing another trajectory of military coups coming back. The most recent has been of of Sudan, and which occurred on the 25th of October 2021, and also we had another one in September which occurred in Guinea. We are seeing the military is taking over governments, civilian governments, and they are promising to hand over back that government, civilian government. But oftentimes the military, whenever the military takes over, they don't keep their promise. Why is it that we are seeing most of this wave of military takeovers again coming back, yet we are now in a state of where we believe that now at least transition should be done through legitimate elections where people who have the power in their hands decide to elect the leaders they want? Why is that we are seeing again the military is coming back to the politics of Africa?
Thank you, Abel. I kind of like a bit lost your initial question. Kind of like went off, but I think let me pick it up from where Henry left it, and the grounding Henry provided this show, because he gave us the history. But we also must appreciate that we don't have a rich history of managing transitions and addressing these aspects to do with succession as a country. Yes, and some will argue that we are a young democracy, and there have been a lot of publications around democracies and transitions in Africa. But you see, democracy is a culture, and it's not a culture that is that comes from nowhere. It's a culture that also is that kind of like it's embedded in the way of life. And this culture also is highly shaped by the social norms and the beliefs we have. Now, when you look at Africa, most African states, unfortunately, our trajectory or history of how democracy is introduced to us does not necessarily address the fundamental issues concerning how should we manage power, and how should power be transferred, and how should power be shared. Uganda, looking at Uganda, for example, Uganda's turbulent history, even when we can boast of the over 35 years of relative stability in the region as a country. But again, you see that how the NRA came into power, it was through a coup. So, and with that kind of mindset on how they assumed office, also will determine on how they manage, or their thinking, or their understanding and appreciation of discussing transition, for that matter. And that explains also why at the moment, discussions around transitions in Uganda right now seems to be a no area. Some people do not appreciate it. It gets lost in trivialized issues, and it's seen more as an attack on the establishment. People cannot appreciate that it's a big question to address. It's something bigger than the NRM. It's something about the country and the future of the country. But you see, that mindset is not unfounded. It has much to do with the people who are in power right now. How did they assume power? Remember, they were part of the previous regimes that were problematic. But also, in terms of the culture of Africans, you realize that we do not necessarily appreciate issues around power sharing as Africans, issues around transitions. And when you introduce democracy with all these with all these aspirations of someone comes and takes leadership for a period of time and hands over to the next person and then hands over the next person, it is something we are grappling to even appreciate within our system of governance, but because it's also not within our system and way of life. I'll give you an example. You realize that it's very common for a head of a family to pass on without necessarily preparing who should take over. Usually there's that assumption that it's the firstborn should take over. But even the firstborn probably is not prepared enough to take over from from the head of the family who has passed on. So you realize that the culture of handing over, not even just handing over, preparing someone who's coming to take over and take it up from where you've left it, is still something as a continent we struggle with. And that extends also in this concept which has been now exported to Africa called democracy. But that said, I think time has come as a country to have a very sober conversation on issues to do with transition and succession, especially the post-Museveni era. Because whether you were a die-hard fan of the general, whether you were a die-hard fan of NRM, there's the bigger question and the bigger elephant in the room right now is the post-Museveni. Because it's not God that will live forever. There will be a time when he has to leave and exit. But then, how do we manage a country past Museveni? And that conversation is a conversation that should not be spearheaded or shouldn't be a conversation which only has, or that space only has politicians. For many occasions, we've seen politicians take lead in this conversation or come up to offer narratives on this conversation. But we've also, history has proved that politicians, by their nature, and I don't know where it comes with the office, they are not trusted people. They are like scavengers. Even those who are trying to have this conversation, some of them are not discussing it genuinely with the prospect of looking at Uganda as a country first. They are more or less looking at it as how do we pick it up? How do we pick the pieces? How do we benefit? How do we structure or position ourselves to benefit from the post-Museveni era? Not necessarily how do we address the underlying issues, the fundamental issues that the country is confronted with right now, and those issues that might be problematic in the post-Museveni era. And that sober discussion, that candid discussion, that honest discussion that will bring on board even citizens themselves to discuss and determine how they should want to see this country move on post-Museveni leadership. How should this country be led, be governed? How should we manage the expectations, and how should we manage the interests? Because there are a lot of interests at play at the moment. How should we deal with those things that have remained unresolved for a long time? As of now, there's so much politics of identity. How do we deal with issues of politics of identity? You see, there are bigger issues that should not be trivialized to Museveni should go. I think for me, that kind of debate, Museveni should go, is looking at Uganda, is reducing Uganda's problems to an individual. Yet there is the country called Uganda is bigger than the smaller issues that are trivialized to an individual. And I think also this space should be protected, and people should be encouraged to discuss how they should want to see Uganda move forward as a country post-Museveni. The regime apologists should also appreciate that this discussion or this conversation is very, very healthy. Now, this is what is happening. They tend to push water under the bridge, and they assume that water is like the water, because the narrative of pushing water under the bridge is on the assumption that water is moving, so it will move. But here we have a situation whereby the water we are pushing under the bridge is stagnant. When water is stagnant and it's not moving, it means that water will stay in one place, and it will probably stagnate. It will start to have a foul smell, and it will start to also have also waterborne parasites and diseases. To put this into context, the water they are pushing under the bridge, the issues they are pushing under the bridge are issues that are not resolved, that remain unresolved, and are the issues that Ugandans are grappling with, that they would want to see resolved. And because of that, then you see some pockets of dissent and all that. Yet some of these things can be discussed. Space should be provided for these issues to be discussed soberly, so that that water under the bridge then does move and flows and allows a country to get on the path of recovery, or on the path of healing. And I think for me, that discussion, because that is part of the transition we are looking at. The transition, this question, should be a question for everybody. It should not be a question for just a few elites, for a few political leaders, for a few people who think that they have the right to discuss transition. It should be a question for everybody, including an ordinary citizen. They should be part of this conversation on the transitions in Africa. Now, unfortunately, the history Henry gives, when you look at it very carefully, is that in many cases, transitions the question of transitions, looking at the democracy of African states, citizens have not been part of that conversation, have not been part of that narrative, have been part of that to determine and influence what kind of transition they would want to see, be part of, influence, and participate in. And usually what happens is that you see a few individuals who think that they have the monopoly and the understanding on how transit should be managed. Some even thinking that the only way to transit is through a coup. And that explains the tragedy Africa is in right now. But also, unfortunately, if we continue taking this path Uganda is taking, of not providing for this space to discuss transition, we may, unfortunately, in the post-Museveni era, find ourselves in a very unfortunate situation, and we wouldn't want to have such reversals. Back to you, moderator.
Thank you so much, Felix. Eddie, you've just had Felix tell us very well that citizens are not participating effectively in the transition processes in most of the African countries and in Uganda in general. And for the case of Uganda, ideally, you do know that Article 1 clearly stipulates that all power belongs to the people, and they can use that power to exercise and choose which kind of government should govern them and at any time. But we have seen that most of these governments have, and people who are part of this government have mastered the art of manipulating the rules of the game. For example, the constitution, which is supposed to be the guiding legal framework of any country, is now being used like a political manifesto for some other candidates. So they use the constitution to push for their own agendas. So how do you, how would you advise people like the African citizens to mobilize themselves and use their own power and demand for meaningful transitions in most of the African countries? Because we are seeing the leaders in power are now manipulative in nature. They have mastered the art of manipulating whatever laws are in place to keep themselves in power. How would you advise citizens to maneuver through such a political system?
Thank you, Abel, for inviting me in this space to discuss this. Before we discuss the role of the citizen, I want us to take a quick flash in regard with what Henry and Felix have mentioned. That where do we come from? That Africa is not immune to the global challenge of authoritarian rule, and you shall recall that when we cried for independence between the 50s and 60s, the colonial masters were generous to give us our independence, and probably at independence, the economies were performing relatively better than some of the economies that are performing today. But also, there was a challenge that probably the colonial masters did not give us enough prep to ensure that we can effectively manage ourselves as African economies, and later on would see people who are supporting the cry for independence beginning to raise up their hands to say no, enough is enough. And that's when we see the independence, the post-independence leaders beginning to have dissent from the public, from the citizens, raising up to demand better ways of life, better ways of education, better ways of health systems. and that's when we start seeing coups in Africa. You shall notice that between 1990 and 2000, for example, Africa had about 2,000 coups, and around the beginning of 1995 to 96, and then 2000 up to now, we start seeing governments having competitive elections in courts. Some of the elections that resulted in two fragile democratic regimes, but also some of the elections are countries where we had a strong, within a democracy, the emergence of strong militaries within these countries. But also, when you realize, to give you a snapshot, in Africa, we have most of the countries almost have had coups. I can give you an example. In Sudan alone, our neighboring Sudan, we have had over 17 coups in Sudan, both the Southern Sudan and Northern Sudan. Chad has had 7 coups. Niger had 7 coups. Ghana has had 10 coups. Sierra Leone has had 10 coups. Guinea-Bissau has had 8 coups. Burundi, this small Burundi of ours, neighbor, they have had over 11 coups. And the Comoros has had 9 coups. You can imagine. And Uganda also had a coup when the current president came into power. But what does that mean? That probably the emergence of a strong military that came with what we call the democracies, and the militarization of the masses. I've had persons, especially the young people, try to have a military mind and probably support the army and support the bad ways within which they think they are being governed, and they are putting up civil unrest to support the military to take over. And these have happened in Sudan, it has happened in Zimbabwe, among others. But I want us to look at transition of politics, political transitions, not from the coup perspective. We have had cases where we have had successful elections. For example, in Ghana, in South Africa, in Tanzania, we have had a semblance of successful elections where we may think that elections have been fair and fair. Remember when one of the American presidents was choosing countries to visit in Africa, they chose Ghana and I think South Africa because of better ways of managing transitions. But also we have had countries where we have had sham elections in Zimbabwe, in Guinea, in Zambia. You remember when Yahya Jammeh lost an election, and at some point when he went to sleep, he remembered, no, I think it's not good to declare that I should have considered elections. And since that it is a sin in Africa to leave power and Africans are drunk on power, I should rescind on my decision and say, no, I did not lose, and therefore I'm still president. But we have also had cases of bloody coups that, just like I've mentioned, but some of the silent coups like we have had in thousands in Sudan and Zimbabwe. In other countries, transitions are managed through pressure groups and civil uprisings. You heard what happened during the Arab Spring in Northern Africa, in the countries of the Arab world, including Morocco, Algeria, Egypt, Libya, among others. But we have also had cases where we have had outscale war. Remember what is happening in Ethiopia right now, in Sudan, Southern Sudan, but also Congo, or in Eastern Congo. There's a war that is breaking up, and most of the Congolese are now receding into Western Uganda and the places of Bundibujo and Kasese. This shows you that the current emergence of coups is as a result of the failure of the present government to meet the demands of the people. But we have also had cases where African military groups fight proxy wars. You remember when in Libya, the US, France, and then Italy were supporting certain groups to dispose the late Colonel Muammar Gaddafi. But also have what we call white collar robbery, where we have commercialized elections and state capture and constitutional amendments masterminded by who we call the honorable members of parliament in African
Eddie, you're breaking. I think I can now go to Gerald. Gerald, you've just heard how Eddie has been discussing about how some of the African countries have had successful elections and how some of them have had some sham elections. And we do believe that, most African leaders believe that this pillar of democracy, which was exported to some of the African countries, is not a choice which some of them should be used, which citizens should use to take them out of power. And most of them just go into elections for just legitimate purposes. And some people have even regarded elections in Africa not as elections, but just a selection process where leaders just go and try to pretend that they are electing them, but in actual sense, they are trying to just keep themselves in power and make the other outside or international world look that they have also passed through elections. So do you think in the current African context, elections are the better way of us having meaningful political transitions? Koraneza? Gerald, are you on? I think Gerald's network is breaking, or is having some technological issues. I think we can now first go for a break, then we shall return with the next segment. Welcome back from that break. Today we are discussing about political transitions in Africa. Before we went for a break, we were still having discussions around elections, whether really Africa has elections or it's just a selection process that is aimed at making the regimes in power look legitimate to the outside world. And I wanted to bring in Gerald to give us his view on whether elections is the right path for most of the African countries, because most of these elections are being manipulated and most citizens are left frustrated, and they believe that the process they undergo at the election is just not for them to choose the leaders of their own choices, but the other leaders know how to manipulate the entire process and make themselves be in power. So I want Gerald, I don't know where Gerald you're on, you can give us your own view on the status of elections in Africa, whether they are the best ways of ushering political transitions in Africa. Okay, I think Gerald is off. Before I come to you, Eddie, let me first come to Felix. Felix, you've just watched that video when we were on for a break, which was looking at state capture. And we have seen there are very many countries in Africa which are under captivity by some of the leaders who are so obsessed with power. These leaders have captured the state institutions and have also militarized the state, and they are instilling a lot of fear amongst the citizens who are the largest stakeholders in any state. And now we are finding citizens even fear to engage in most of the political process because they do know they cannot do anything. So how do you think, or how possible is it for citizens to be able to figure out a way of overcoming such a political system whereby institutions are being captured by a few individuals, and also they are using the military to keep themselves in power? How can citizens overcome such a situation and cause maybe meaningful transition in some of those countries that are under captivity? I think you're muted. I'm not
Patra?
getting you clearly.
Patra has to unmute me. Patra, I think, muted me.
Now, you're now okay. You're now fine.
Okay.
You can proceed.
Yeah, thank you. And I was just writing in the chat that I think elections are the new coup. You see, even with an election, which is stage managed, and it's usurping the will of the people, you are again using that stage managed election to conduct a coup. So for me, even with these new popular elections method of many African leaders trying to sanitize their stay in power, is being held and uploaded, and it's the new way of keeping in power. Is also another way of it's the new emerging way of doing coups on people's will. But that said, you raise an issue around whether how can then the citizens who unfortunately find themselves victims of the capture of state institutions, the capture of power by a few elites, by a few political leaders, with the support of the security agencies and military. I think this is a situation that will require populations coming together. You see, at the end of it all, the will of the people will prevail, but the will of people prevail. It must prevail when they come together and work and leverage on their numbers. Unfortunately, the way our politics is structured right now, it's a bit more of divisive politics and politics of identity. So we have very many things that divide us, that do not give us an opportunity to come together and pursue a common agenda. And because of that, it becomes we become vulnerable to state capture or to the effects of state capture. And the situation of Africa, let me say at continental level, the situation of Africa, where you have very many ethnicities, you have very many tribes, you have very many cultures. There are always those things within which political leaders will exploit to keep you divided and not necessarily pursue a common agenda, especially if you are facing a common enemy. When you come to Uganda, for example, unfortunately, Uganda, we seem to be more divided than before. We seem to be having, even when I've had some of these situations where you have new constituencies crafted out of ethnicity, disagreements between one ethnic group, and because of that, then they will start demand for their own constituency. So that kind of thing, and that's just one of the examples. That kind of environment where you are continuously kept divided will not give us the opportunity to look at the challenges we face as one people, as one nation, Uganda, as a group belonging to an entity called Uganda, all as a group belonging to an entity called Kenya. So the divisive politics exploits already the existing divisions within Africa, and that's a colonial thing we inherited, because even when the colonialists came and to conquer us, they had to divide us along a number of lines: religion, ethnicity, tribe, and all that. So and that we've never recovered from that division, and unfortunately, even our leaders have continued to use or benefit from that kind of division to keep us divided, and that makes us weak, makes us vulnerable to the excesses of bad leadership. And one of those excesses is state capture, and unfortunately that's where we are. So until we can rise above certain things that divide us, and until we can come together and confront these things with one mind, with one accord, with one understanding, with the appreciation that the problems that are facing us are not necessarily problems that are isolated to specific ethnic lines or specific religious beliefs, or we will continue to be victims of state capture. And unfortunately, as a country, as a continent, that's where we are. Back to you, moderator.
Thank you so much, Gerald. As you've been hearing, Felix really articulated that for us to have transitions that are really collective and have citizens on the agenda, citizens need to rise up and use their power to demand for what belongs to them, so that each transition that happens serves their own interests. And we have seen in the Arab Spring, there was a youthful movement that came up to rise up against most of the injustices that were happening in most of their countries. And this was a combination with using of social media. I want to hear from you as the youth and someone who is passionate of the new revolution of social media in the political arena of most of the African countries. Is it the right trajectory for us to now utilize the youthful continent which we have, and they use their lyrical strengths to rally behind all the women, all the old persons, and they come and champion the agenda of meaningful political transitions? Because if we fail to have meaningful transitions through elections, because elections are being manipulated, and also sometimes the military.
Thank you so much, Abel.
Not always serve the interests of the citizens. What is your say on that? Gerald, are you on? I think Gerald has a technical issue. I would like to bring Henry on board. Henry, I've just had.
Okay, thank you so much, Bwana Abel.
Okay, Gerald.
Indeed, youth are yearning for change, and the only legitimate means of a transition in Africa is through elections. But youth, we've been really disappointed. Yes, I'm on, Abel. I think
yes,
you can hear me.
You can proceed.
So, Abel, can you hear me?
Yes, you proceed, Gerald.
Can I, Abel, you can hear me?
Proceed, proceed with your point.
Abel?
I think you're having technical challenges. We shall come back to you, Gerald. I want now go to Henry. And we have seen most of the leaders who always champion these political coups come with a lot of promises. They champion coups and they champion transitions in Africa. They come with a lot of promises how they want to help re-engineer the governance system to serve the interests of the people. But after them assuming power after a certain period of time, they become obsessed with power and they forget that they're supposed to serve the interests of the people. And they tend to serve their own interests. Why is it that most of these people, whenever they come with sweet words, but after assuming power, they tend to not serve the interests of the people and they start serving themselves? Some of them even have they come with point programs on what they want to achieve, But if you try to assess them based on their plans, they don't necessarily score highly in some of those plans. Why is it that this is the case in most African countries?
Thank you very much, Abel. I've been struggling with the internet, and I always do, thanks to the mafias that manage this internet service and give us road deals. But I want to answer a question. Before I do it, I want to pick it up from where Felix, I think there was a question you asked, but by the time I went off the line, the question of why elections have not provided a feasible alternative, feasible answer to political transitions. And my answer to that is because elections have been flawed. Elections in Africa have been so monetized, have been so securitized, militarized, and in the end, what you have is a complete fraud, because money, securitization, and many other factors have been used to control voter consent. So what you have is not a true expression of the peoples of the land, but a will of the leaders who want to entrench themselves in power. But having said that, let me refer you to Ethiopia. Ethiopia, we had an election last year, of course, which was won by His Excellency Ahmed Abiy. But as we speak today, the Tigray and their alliance are marching on towards Addis Ababa to take over a government that was elected hardly a year back. These are some of the things that we need to ponder about ourselves as Africans. And we don't need any white people or Western people to lecture to us about this. The truth is we have a problem within ourselves. I don't know whether inherently the African God-embedded more greed within us Africans, the greed for power. Because democracy cannot thrive and blossom in a situation where everybody wants to be president, everybody wants to be prime minister. You see, a situation where the election is never won or lost, a situation where all elections must be either stolen or rigged, you cannot have democracy. And therefore, you have a situation where there are a few men that have captured a cabal of a few people, men and women, that have captured the state and captured the political space. They are the ones that think they have a right to rule. So if one of them is not seated in the state house, then they must go and fight, and in the end, it's the voters that suffer. But let me go to your question, because the question was, what is wrong with us? But I think as you were asking this question, I could not help but remember the book written by Niccolo Machiavelli. You remember the book called The Prince?
The Prince.
In that book, Machiavelli says that the main task of the prince is to make sure that he remains in power. I think that's one of the lines that the leaders in Africa have memorized so well and mastered the art of remaining in power. But of course, Machiavelli says, even when you remain in power, you should do some good, pursue some glory, give happiness to your people. You don't have to be ruthless, because according to Machiavelli, it is manly to make sure your people enjoy justice, and beastly, like you become an animal if you use force. And do things. So you the kind of things we are seeing in Ethiopia, in Mali, in Guinea, these are tendencies of beasts, not manly tendencies. And therefore, I think until a certain time when we as Africans can have a colloquy, or if you like, a serious conversation on who we are, and understand that there has to come a time when you concede defeat, when you accept that this let the other person lead. But the situation where everybody thinks the power is theirs by right, I think it's not helping. Just home here in Uganda, you might find there are groups, ethnic groups that think that power is theirs by right. Now, if someone thinks it's our right to build power, how can you have peaceful transitions? I think this is a conversation we have to get back on and understand that at any one time there must be only a few men in power. But a situation where everybody wants to be in power, if they're not in power, they take up arms or they organize a military coup or they go to the bush and organize a civil war. This should stop. In fact, if Machiavelli came back today, he would laugh and praise himself for having been so visionary as to write about, because he wrote in 1500. So in 1500, you're writing the book, but you're predicting what will happen in the 2000s. This is a mockery. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. Eddie, you've heard how most of your colleagues have hinted on the issue of the use of money in elections or in our politics. And we do know that most of the political leaders now look at politics as a business, not as a service. So leadership is more of a business now to them, it's not a service. And they go there to amass a lot of wealth, and they don't want to leave chance for others to come and be part of that lucrative venture. So do you think it's possible for citizens to really engage meaningfully with such leaders who have a perception that it's our own gold mine, it's us to be in that gold mine, no one else should be part of that? Can citizens really be able to champion a move or a movement to relinquish power from such people and bring back power to them? As your parting shot, or as you give us a parting shot, because we have run out of time, so I will start with you, Eddie. You're muted.
The citizens have been taken for a ride, and the current politicians, especially members of parliament in Africa, have used what we call white-collar robbery, where they go to parliaments and houses, legislative houses, to amend constitutions for them to stay in power so that they can continue earning what they want to earn, right? Secondly, now, the fact that the citizen in Africa is poor, the only thing he has remained to do is to remain a beggar of these politician who is there to amass wealth for himself. And of course, this has played bad on Africa's politics, because the leader continues to be drunk on power. He still looks at it as a sin to leave power, and until of recent, especially in countries that are stronger than Uganda, that we have had citizens waking up. You see what is happening in Southern Sudan. So far, we have had 2 civil uprisings where military leaders have been disposed, and they're demanding to give power to the citizens. Probably this has been as a result of increasing civic activism within the population. It's been a result of the e-generation that is consuming modern information and education, communication and technology, that is honing fellow youth and women to come and rise up. But also, Africa is now living more in an open society where people have access to as much information as possible. And when you look at most of these countries, including Ethiopia, where there is war, they have been using technology to hone the youthful people to come and join the Tigray to dispose of Abel, I'm hearing echo from the background, to dispose of the current government. But where are the blocks? Where are the African blocks that we were talking about? We're hearing of SADC. We are hearing of the East African Community. We are hearing of the ECOWAS. We are hearing of the Arab League, the Organization of African Unity. Where are they? What is their role in bringing back political and transition order in Africa? We cannot see them coming out. And for as long as we cannot bring back these blocks to have a meaningful conversation on how to put barriers towards leaders that are greedy, we might not see effective transition in Africa. When we have an East African issue as the East African Community, we don't come up to say so and so is doing bad. We are just condoning and bringing the issue of sovereignty of each of these countries in a way of managing their own processes. And back to the politicians, we have had these leaders amassing as much wealth as possible, and for as long as they do not, the greed continues, just like Henry mentioned. They cannot let any of this go into the citizens. The economies are shattered. A citizen that is not empowered, a citizen that is not economically inclusive, a citizen that is not have access to information cannot be a citizen that can take charge of his own political processes. And I really thank those that have been able to make it up, like the Sudanese, and probably Ugandans must also have a backbone to follow suit. Thank you, Abel.
Thank you. Felix, your parting shot? Felix, your parting shot? I think Felix has also is not getting us very well. Henry, can you give us your parting shot?
Yeah, of course, I have here issues with the internet connection in Uganda, which is quite absurd. But my parting shot is that the reason we are failing to manage transitions, the reason we are oscillating between democracy and military coups and civil wars, is because we have failed to have leaders that put public interest first. The leaders we have today in Africa put their personal interests, sectional or personal, or party or corporate interests first before they consider public interest. And because of this, they get to be greedy and fight for power. I want to argue that if our leaders were putting public interest first, there would actually be no reason for civil society or any other uprisings that distort democracy and they take the reverse the democratic progression back to civil war. So it's important that we get back to, we have leaders in place, leaders that put service above self, not those that go power for self-enrichment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. Felix, can you give us your parting shot?
Thank you, Abel. I think in line with Henry, such leaders, unfortunately in Africa, they will need to have another force from the population pushing them to behave so. And as long as we don't have a very vigilant electorate, a very aggressive electorate in terms of demanding for what is theirs, we shall continue to have leaders who do things with impunity and get away with it. And I think for me, I think time has come for the voters, for the electorate, for the other sections of society to stop leaving things to politicians and get involved and put a lot of pressure and demand, so that these leaders that are in power know that they cannot get away with certain acts that they are doing. Until we have that balance of power between leaders and those elected, and between elected leaders and the electorate, until we have that balance of scale, we will not be able to have the Africa we want, that is an Africa continent taking care of the needs, putting people first, like the desired democracy we all aspire for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. Thanks so much, Felix. Thanks so much, Eddie and Gerald, for sharing your views with our audience today. And we also want to appreciate all the audience outside there who have been watching and listening to us from the start up to the end. This is The Other Perspective. We shall again have another edition next week on Wednesday, same time. So keep always in touch with us, but also keep following us on our social media platforms. On Twitter, we are ACFIM-UG. On Facebook, ACFIM. Facebook, on YouTube, ACFIM Uganda. I remain Abel Eseru. Enjoy your day. Thank you.